"You're a burden, Mom." The words landed harder than any hospital diagnosis ever could. Daniel Collins didn't whisper them. He didn't lower his voice. He said them right there in room 214 of St. Joseph Medical Center, in front of nurses, visitors, and two elderly patients whose conversations instantly stopped. The room seemed to shrink around Margaret Collins. At 72 years old, she sat quietly in the hospital bed with a thin blanket folded across her lap and her hands resting gently on top of it. Outside the window, a gray Ohio afternoon pressed against the glass, but inside the room, every eye had turned toward her. Daniel stood near the foot of the bed, expensive watch on his wrist, tailored jacket draped over one arm, looking more frustrated than concerned. "I've spent years dealing with this," he continued. "Doctor appointments. Bills. Problems. I can't keep putting my life on hold." Margaret lowered her eyes. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't remind him of the nights she stayed awake when he was sick as a child or the years she worked double shifts to keep food on the table. She simply sat there in silence. Somehow, that silence made the room feel even heavier. Near the doorway, Nurse Emily Carter paused with a tablet in her hands. She had entered to review medication notes, but now she couldn't move. Something about the expression on Margaret's face stopped her cold. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was disappointment so deep it looked older than the woman herself. Daniel paced toward the window. "The house needs to be sold. That's the reality. The maintenance costs are ridiculous. And honestly, Mom, an assisted living facility would be better for everyone." Margaret slowly looked up. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "For everyone?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "You know what I mean." A long silence followed. The air felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. In the hallway outside, a food cart rattled past. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang. Life continued as normal for everyone else. Inside room 214, however, something important was quietly falling apart. Emily glanced between mother and son. She had worked at St. Joseph for nearly 10 years. She had witnessed arguments, reconciliations, tears, and miracles. But there was something unsettling about this conversation. Daniel spoke as if he were carrying a burden. Margaret sat there like someone carrying a secret. The difference mattered. Daniel checked his phone. "I've already spoken to a realtor," he said. "The house could sell fast in this market. Maybe within 30 days. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. It was the first visible reaction she had shown. Emily noticed. Daniel didn't. "I think it's time," he added. "We need to be practical." Margaret turned her gaze toward the small bedside table. A framed family photograph sat there beside a glass of water. The picture showed a much younger Daniel wearing a graduation gown, smiling so wide his face could barely contain it. Margaret remembered that day perfectly. Daniel only remembered the diploma. Emily followed Margaret's eyes to the photograph. Something about it lingered in her mind. Then she noticed a sealed manila envelope partially tucked beneath a stack of medical records on a nearby shelf. It looked old. Deliberately stored. Almost forgotten. Almost. Daniel slid his phone back into his pocket. "I'll come by tomorrow with the paperwork." Margaret nodded once. No protest. No fight. No anger. That should have made things easier. Instead, it made the room feel colder. As Daniel walked toward the door, Emily stepped aside. He barely acknowledged her presence. A moment later, he disappeared into the hallway. The silence he left behind felt louder than his words. Margaret continued staring at the photograph. Emily looked at the elderly woman, then at the old envelope resting among the files. She couldn't explain why, but she suddenly felt certain of one thing. The story Daniel believed about his mother was not the truth. And before long, everyone in that hospital was going to find out why. The door clicked shut behind Daniel, and the room seemed to exhale. Margaret Collins remained still for several seconds, her eyes fixed on the photograph beside her bed. The smile on her son's younger face looked almost unfamiliar now. Back then, he had run across a football field after graduation and wrapped both arms around her, telling everyone who would listen that his mother was the strongest person he knew. The memory drifted through her mind like a fading song. Nurse Emily Carter quietly set her tablet on a nearby counter. She was supposed to continue her rounds, but something kept her there. Margaret was not crying. She was not angry. She looked like someone carrying the weight of an entire lifetime without asking anyone to help. "Would you like some water?" Emily asked gently. Margaret turned and offered a small smile. "I am all right, dear." Her voice carried warmth despite everything that had happened. Emily nodded but did not leave. The silence between them felt oddly comfortable. Outside the room, carts rolled down the hallway and overhead speakers announced routine updates. Inside, time seemed slower. Margaret glanced back toward the photograph. "That was his college graduation," she said softly. Emily followed her gaze. "He looked very happy." Margaret's smile deepened for a moment. "He was." Then it disappeared. Emily noticed the change immediately. It was not sadness that crossed the older woman's face. It was longing. The kind that came from remembering a version of someone who no longer existed. Margaret adjusted the blanket across her lap. Her hands were thin now, marked by decades of work and sacrifice. Yet there was still quiet strength in them. Emily had seen those hands before. Not literally, but in people like Margaret. Mothers who spent their entire lives building bridges for others and then stood alone when everyone crossed to the other side. "Your son seems stressed," Emily offered carefully. Margaret looked out the window. Gray clouds hung low over the city. "Life can make people forget things." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Forget what?" Margaret took a long breath. "Where they came from." The answer lingered in the room. Emily felt something tighten in her chest. She remembered her own mother working overtime shifts when she was growing up. She remembered packed lunches, late-night rides, and sacrifices that had never been discussed because they were simply given out of love. Margaret's eyes returned to the photograph again. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. Daniel at 10 years old. A winter night. Snow falling outside a small apartment. The power bill was overdue. Margaret had wrapped him in blankets and told him they were having an indoor camping adventure. He laughed the entire evening, never realizing she had skipped 3 meals that week to keep the heat running. Another memory followed. Daniel at 17. College acceptance letter in his hands. Tears in his eyes. He had hugged her so tightly she could barely breathe. "We did it, Mom," he had said. "We did it." Not "I did it." "We did it." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Somewhere along the way, that word had disappeared. Emily noticed her expression soften and then fade. The nurse glanced toward the shelf holding the medical files. Her eyes landed once again on the old manila envelope tucked beneath the records. It looked worn around the edges, as though it had been handled many times before finally being stored away. There was something deliberate about it. Something important. Before Emily could think further, a hospital volunteer entered briefly to deliver fresh linens. The interruption broke the moment. Margaret thanked the volunteer with the same kindness she showed everyone. After the woman left, Emily found herself wondering how someone so gentle could be spoken to the way Daniel had spoken to her. Then Margaret quietly reached toward the bedside table and touched the edge of the graduation photograph. "I never wanted anything from him," she whispered. "Not money. Not recognition. Not gratitude." Emily listened carefully. Margaret's eyes remained on the smiling young man frozen in the frame. "I only wanted him to remember." The room fell silent again. Emily looked from the photograph to the old envelope resting among the files. A strange feeling settled over her. Whatever Daniel believed about his mother, whatever story he had been telling himself for years, it was incomplete. And somehow, she was beginning to suspect that the forgotten envelope held the missing chapter. After finishing her rounds, Emily Carter could not stop thinking about the envelope. The image of it lingered in her mind long after she left room 214. Most hospital paperwork looked ordinary. This did not. It sat beneath the medical files like something waiting patiently for the right moment. By late afternoon, rain tapped softly against the hospital windows. The hallways grew quieter as visiting hours approached their end. Emily returned to the nurse's station and began updating patient records. Yet every few minutes, her attention drifted back to Margaret Collins. Something about the older woman troubled her. Not because she seemed fragile. Margaret was stronger than most people Emily knew. It was because she carried herself like someone preparing to leave a story unfinished. An hour later, Emily walked back toward room 214 to deliver updated medication instructions. Margaret was resting peacefully. The photograph remained beside her bed. The envelope remained tucked beneath the files. As Emily organized paperwork, she noticed a handwritten note attached to the outside. The writing had faded with age. She leaned slightly closer. Her heartbeat slowed. The note contained only one sentence. "Open only if Daniel ever abandons me." Emily froze. For a moment, she wondered whether she had read it correctly. Then she read it again. The same words stared back at her. "Open only if Daniel ever abandons me." A chill moved through her chest. Margaret opened her eyes and noticed Emily standing near the shelf. Their gazes met. Neither spoke. Emily suddenly felt as though she had stumbled across something deeply personal. She stepped away immediately. "I am sorry," she said gently. Margaret looked toward the envelope. For the first time since Emily had met her, a shadow crossed the older woman's face. Not fear. Not embarrassment. Recognition. Then Margaret looked away. The silence between them seemed to stretch forever. Finally, Emily asked softly, "How long has that been there?" Margaret stared out the window where rain streaked across the glass. "Many years." Emily waited. Margaret offered nothing more. The answer only deepened the mystery. Many years. Long before this hospital room. Long before today's argument. Long before Daniel called his own mother a burden. Emily felt questions building in her mind. What was inside the envelope? Why had Margaret prepared it? What had she expected might happen? Before she could ask anything else, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Daniel had returned. He entered carrying a leather folder beneath one arm and a coffee cup in his hand. His expression looked impatient. Businesslike. He barely acknowledged Emily before focusing on his mother. "I spoke with the realtor again," he said. "The market is still strong. We should not wait." Margaret remained quiet. Daniel set the folder on a nearby table. "The paperwork is almost ready." Emily watched the exchange carefully. Something felt different now. Earlier she had seen a frustrated son. Now she saw a man rushing toward a decision without looking back. Daniel glanced around the room. His eyes briefly passed over the shelf holding the envelope. He did not notice it. Or perhaps he had forgotten it existed. Either possibility felt important. "You cannot stay in that house forever," Daniel continued. "It is too much responsibility." Margaret folded her hands together. "That house raised you." Daniel sighed heavily. "A house is just a house." The words lingered in the air. Margaret looked down. Emily saw the pain immediately. Some statements sounded practical. Others revealed more than the speaker intended. This one revealed plenty. Daniel checked his watch. "I have another meeting soon." Meeting. The word felt strange inside a hospital room. Margaret nodded politely as if he were a stranger discussing the weather. Emily found herself studying the envelope again. Open only if Daniel ever abandons me. Suddenly the sentence no longer felt like a precaution. It felt like a countdown that had finally reached zero. And somewhere deep inside, Emily began to suspect that whatever waited inside that envelope was about to change everything Daniel believed about his own life. That evening, the rain continued falling over St. Joseph Medical Center, turning the parking lot lights into blurred reflections across the pavement. Inside room 214, the atmosphere felt no less heavy. Daniel remained focused on documents, schedules, and deadlines. Margaret remained focused on none of them. She sat quietly beside the window, watching drops of water slide down the glass. It reminded her of years slipping away. Emily Carter finished her shift paperwork but found herself returning to the same question again and again. Why would a mother prepare an envelope decades in advance with instructions tied to abandonment? The thought refused to leave her alone. Near 7 o'clock, another nurse asked Emily to retrieve archived records from a storage cabinet connected to several long-term patient files. Emily agreed and headed toward the records room. The hospital basement was quiet at that hour. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. As she searched for a file, she noticed the Collins family name appearing more than once in older records. At first, it meant nothing. Then curiosity took hold. She carefully reviewed the dates. Some documents stretched back nearly 20 years. Most people would have ignored them. Emily could not. Something about Margaret's story felt unfinished. As she scanned the files, small details began forming a picture. There were references to emergency financial assistance programs, educational support forms, loan guarantee paperwork. The names attached to the applications caught her attention. Daniel Collins. Again and again. Emily frowned. The dates corresponded with major periods in a young adult's life. College. Early employment. Housing. Business loans. She was not seeing the full story yet, but she could see enough to know one thing. Daniel's path had not been as independent as he claimed. Upstairs, Daniel sat across from his mother while checking messages on his phone. The realtor thinks we could close within 6 weeks, he said. The property value is higher than expected. Margaret listened politely. Her eyes remained calm. You seem excited. Daniel nodded. It is the smart move. Margaret studied him for a moment. Do you remember the first time we walked into that house? Daniel barely looked up. Not really. The answer arrived too quickly. Margaret smiled sadly. She remembered every detail. She remembered the smell of fresh paint. The worn carpet in the hallway. The tiny backyard where Daniel spent entire summers throwing a baseball against a wooden fence. Most of all, she remembered signing papers with trembling hands because she was terrified she could not afford the mortgage. But she signed anyway. She wanted her son to have stability. Daniel's phone buzzed again. Another message. Another distraction. Another reason not to look backward. Across the hospital, Emily continued sorting through records. Then she found something unexpected. A handwritten authorization form signed by Margaret Collins. Attached to it was documentation of a substantial financial commitment made years earlier on behalf of her son. Emily's eyes widened. This was not ordinary parental support. This was sacrifice on a scale few people would ever understand. The more she read, the more questions emerged. Why had Daniel never mentioned any of this? Did he even know? The answer seemed increasingly obvious. He did not. Emily carefully returned the documents to their folders. She was beginning to understand why Margaret never defended herself. Some people spend years proving their love through actions instead of words. The tragedy was that actions often become invisible once they succeed. Back in room 214, Daniel finally stood to leave. I will come by tomorrow morning, he said. We can finish discussing everything then. Margaret nodded. Of course. Daniel hesitated briefly at the doorway. For a second, it looked like he wanted to say something more. Something personal. Something meaningful. Instead, he simply left. The door closed behind him. Margaret turned back toward the darkened window. Several floors below, headlights moved through the rain like distant stars. She looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. As though she had spent years carrying a truth nobody cared to hear. Meanwhile, Emily stood alone in the records room holding questions that were rapidly turning into answers. And with every document she uncovered, the sealed envelope in room 214 felt less like a mystery and more like a warning waiting for the exact moment it had been written for. The next morning arrived beneath a sky still covered in clouds. St. Joseph Medical Center stirred awake with the familiar rhythm of carts rolling through hallways, doctors beginning rounds, and visitors carrying coffee cups through automatic doors. In room 214, Margaret Collins sat quietly in her chair near the window. She had barely slept. The photograph remained beside her. The envelope remained untouched. Yet something had changed. It was as if an invisible clock had started counting down. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Daniel entered carrying a folder thicker than the one from the previous day. His expression suggested he had already made every important decision. "Good morning," he said. Margaret smiled politely. "Good morning, Daniel." He sat down across from her and opened the folder. Pages of documents appeared one after another. Real estate forms. Property evaluations. Financial projections. Daniel spoke confidently, the way successful people often do when they believe the numbers support them. "I have reviewed everything," he said. "Selling the house is the logical choice. The equity alone could cover years of care." Margaret listened without interrupting. Outside the room, Emily Carter happened to be reviewing patient charts at a nearby station. Through the partially open door, voices drifted into the hallway. At first she paid little attention. Then Daniel said something that stopped her cold. "Everything I have today, I built myself." The sentence hung in the air like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Inside the room, Margaret lowered her eyes. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She had spent half the previous evening reviewing records that suggested the exact opposite. Daniel continued speaking. "I worked for my success. I took risks. I built my career from nothing." Margaret remained silent. The silence felt painful now. Emily could almost hear the years hidden inside it. Suddenly, Margaret remembered a different morning decades earlier. Daniel was 18. The kitchen table was covered with college acceptance papers. Tuition costs sat printed in black ink like an impossible mountain. Daniel had looked excited. Margaret had looked terrified. She remembered smiling anyway. She remembered telling him they would find a way. What Daniel never knew was that she spent that night sitting alone in her car outside a pawn shop. Her wedding ring rested in her palm. The last physical reminder of the man she had loved. By sunrise, the ring was gone. The tuition deposit was paid. Another memory surfaced. Daniel at 24. His first business venture collapsing under debt. Collection notices arriving faster than opportunities. He had called her one evening sounding defeated. "I think I ruined everything, Mom." Margaret remembered reassuring him for nearly an hour. What she did not tell him was that she spent the next week liquidating nearly all of her retirement savings. The funds appeared in his account through a legal intermediary. Daniel assumed a private investor had stepped in. He never questioned it. He never knew. Back in the hospital room, Daniel kept talking. "Nobody handed me anything." Margaret slowly looked toward the photograph on the bedside table. The smiling graduate in the frame seemed to belong to another lifetime. Emily stood frozen outside the doorway. The records she had discovered replayed in her mind. The loan guarantees. The financial assistance forms. The signatures. The sacrifices. Every page contradicted the story Daniel was telling. Yet Margaret still refused to defend herself. That refusal disturbed Emily more than any argument could have. Finally, Daniel closed the folder. I have carried enough responsibility. The words landed harder than he realized. Margaret inhaled slowly. For a moment, Emily thought she might finally speak. Instead, Margaret simply nodded. It was the same quiet nod she had given throughout the entire ordeal. A nod that carried patience, heartbreak, and dignity all at once. Daniel interpreted it as agreement. He did not see what Emily saw. He did not see the years behind his mother's eyes. He did not see the cost of every opportunity he proudly claimed as his own. And as Emily glanced toward the shelf where the old envelope waited beneath the files, she understood something with absolute certainty. The truth was no longer hiding. It was gathering strength. And very soon, someone was going to open the door that had kept it locked away for years. The room felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. Sunlight struggled through the clouds outside, casting a pale glow across the floor of room 214. Daniel Collins stood beside the bed with a pen in his hand and a stack of documents spread across the tray table. To him, everything appeared settled. Numbers had been calculated. Decisions had been made. Timelines had been established. The future seemed organized and efficient. Margaret Collins sat quietly across from him, her hands folded in her lap. She looked tired, but not defeated. There was a difference. Daniel flipped to the final page. Once these forms are completed, the transition process can begin. His voice carried the confidence of someone convinced he was solving a problem. Margaret glanced toward the window. You seem certain. Daniel nodded. I am. Then he added the sentence that changed everything. I have carried you long enough. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Even the sounds from the hallway seemed to disappear for a moment. Margaret did not respond immediately. Her eyes lowered toward the blanket resting across her knees. Emily Carter stood just outside the partially open door, reviewing medication notes. The instant she heard those words, she stopped reading. A wave of disbelief moved through her. Carried you long enough. After everything she had discovered in the records room, the statement felt almost impossible to hear. Inside the room, Daniel continued. I have responsibilities. My own life. My own future. At some point I have to stop carrying everyone else's burdens. Margaret slowly looked up. There was no anger in her expression. Only sadness. The kind of sadness that comes when someone rewrites history and truly believes the new version. Daniel mistook her silence for acceptance. He slid the papers closer. This is the best solution. Margaret studied her son carefully. For a brief moment she saw the boy who once reached for her hand while crossing busy streets. The teenager who called her whenever life became overwhelming. The young man who promised he would never forget everything she had done for him. Then the image disappeared. Reality returned. Outside the room, Emily felt her pulse quicken. Every record she had reviewed echoed in her memory. The tuition payments. The loan guarantees. The emergency transfers. The sacrifices hidden behind signatures and legal forms. Daniel spoke as though he had spent years carrying his mother. The documents told a very different story. Emily looked toward the shelf. The old envelope remained where it had always been. Waiting. Patient. Silent. Suddenly she understood why Margaret had created it. Some truths are not written for ordinary days. They are written for moments exactly like this one. Daniel picked up his pen. I can have everything finalized by the end of the week. Margaret's gaze drifted toward the family photograph beside her bed. The smiling graduate stared back at her from another era. You really believe you did all of this alone? She asked softly. Daniel hesitated. I worked for everything I have. Margaret nodded once. The answer seemed to confirm something she already knew. Not about money. Not about success. About memory. Emily could not remain silent any longer. She stepped into the doorway. Daniel turned, surprised to see her standing there. For the first time, Emily did not look away. Her voice was calm, but firm. That is not true. The room froze. Daniel blinked. Excuse me? Emily took another step forward. Her heart pounded, but her eyes never left his. Margaret looked at her in shock. The nurse glanced briefly toward the shelf where the envelope rested among the files. Then she looked back at Daniel. There are things you do not know, she said quietly. The confidence in Daniel's face began to crack. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, uncertainty entered the room. And for the first time in years, the truth was no longer willing to stay silent. Daniel stared at Emily Carter as though she had spoken a language he did not understand. The confidence that had carried him through the morning faltered. What are you talking about? He asked. Emily glanced toward Margaret. The older woman looked almost pleading, not because she feared the truth, but because she had spent so many years protecting it. Emily took a slow breath. I am talking about the things your mother never told you. The room grew still. Even the distant sounds from the hallway seemed to fade into the background. Daniel folded his arms. I built my life through hard work. Emily nodded. You worked hard. Nobody is denying that. Then her voice sharpened slightly. But you did not do it alone. Daniel laughed once, a short uncertain laugh. What exactly are you suggesting? Emily stepped toward the shelf and carefully picked up the old envelope. The worn paper looked older than some of the equipment in the room. Margaret closed her eyes. She knew what was coming. Emily looked at the handwritten instruction on the front. Then she opened it. Inside were letters, copies of financial documents, bank records, and signed agreements stretching back decades. Daniel's expression changed immediately. What is that? Emily removed the first document. Your college tuition fund. Daniel frowned. I had scholarships. Emily nodded again. Some. Not all. She handed him a copy of a payment record. Margaret's signature appeared at the bottom. Daniel stared at it. Emily continued. The semester you almost dropped out because you could not afford tuition, someone paid the balance. Daniel looked confused. A private donor. Emily shook her head. No. Your mother. Silence filled the room. Daniel looked from the document to Margaret. She said nothing. Emily reached for another paper. Do you remember your first business? Daniel swallowed. Of course. Do you remember the debt? Emily asked. His eyes narrowed. Yes. Emily placed another record in front of him. When your company was weeks away from failing, a financial guarantee was issued that allowed your lender to keep working with you. Daniel stared at the signature. The same name appeared again. Margaret Collins. His face lost color. No. Emily's voice remained calm. Yes. She opened another file. The down payment on your current house. Another document. Another signature. Another sacrifice. The emergency funds transferred during the recession. Another document. The loan that kept your company operating when your biggest client left. Another document. The money that prevented bankruptcy. Another document. Every page told the same story. Every page carried the same name. Margaret Collins. Daniel's hands began trembling slightly as he turned page after page. The room felt smaller with every revelation. Why did nobody tell me? He whispered. Emily looked at him carefully. Because she asked them not to. Daniel slowly turned toward his mother. Is this true? Margaret finally spoke. You needed opportunities, Daniel. Not guilt. The words hit harder than any accusation ever could. Daniel looked down at the mountain of evidence spread across the tray table. His entire narrative was collapsing in front of him. The self-made success story he had repeated for years suddenly seemed incomplete. Not false. Just incomplete. Painfully incomplete. Emily unfolded the final letter from the envelope. The paper was yellowed with age. She read aloud. If Daniel ever believes he succeeded without help, do not blame him. Success has a way of erasing the footsteps behind us. Just remind him that every door he walked through was opened by someone who loved him first. Daniel lowered his head. Tears filled his eyes before he realized they were there. Across from him, Margaret sat quietly, exactly as she had throughout the entire ordeal. She had not demanded credit. She had not defended herself. She had not exposed him. She had simply loved him. And in that moment, Daniel realized the burden had never been his mother. The burden was the truth he had forgotten. The documents remained spread across the tray table like pieces of a life Daniel Collins had never fully seen. The room was silent except for the faint hum of hospital equipment and the distant sound of footsteps moving through the hallway. Daniel stared at the signatures again and again, hoping they would somehow change. They never did. Every page led back to the same person. Every sacrifice carried the same name. Margaret Collins. His mother sat quietly across from him, her hands resting gently in her lap. She looked exactly the same as she had an hour earlier. Yet now Daniel felt as though he were seeing her for the first time. The years he had overlooked suddenly appeared all at once. The extra shifts she worked. The vacations she never took. The clothes she never bought. The dreams she quietly postponed. All of it had become the foundation beneath his own success. Daniel lowered his head. "Why?" he whispered. His voice sounded smaller than before. "Why would you do all of that and never tell me?" Margaret smiled softly. It was the kind of smile only a parent could give. "Because that is not how love works." Daniel closed his eyes. The answer hurt because it was so simple. Emily Carter remained near the doorway, giving them space. She thought the revelations were over. Then she noticed another document tucked inside the envelope. It was newer than the others. Her expression changed immediately. Margaret saw it too. For the first time all day, concern crossed her face. Emily carefully unfolded the paper. It was a medical report. The date was recent. Very recent. Daniel looked up. "What is it?" Emily hesitated. Margaret shook her head slightly, almost imperceptibly. Daniel noticed. "Mom?" Margaret looked away toward the window. Outside, the clouds had finally begun to break apart. Sunlight touched the parking lot below. Emily took a slow breath. "There is something else you should know." Daniel's stomach tightened. The room suddenly felt cold. Emily looked at the report again before speaking. "Your mother has been declining treatment recommendations for months." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" No one answered immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Daniel looked from Emily to Margaret. "Mom?" Margaret folded her hands together. "I did not want to worry you." Daniel stood up so quickly his chair shifted backward. "Worry me?" His voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" Margaret's eyes glistened. "You were busy building your life." The words shattered something inside him. Emily gently placed the report on the table. "Her condition is more serious than she allowed anyone to tell you." Daniel stared at the paper without fully understanding it. Medical terms blurred together. Dates. Evaluations. Recommendations. Follow-up plans that had never happened. Then one sentence caught his attention. His face drained of color. "No," he whispered. Margaret looked down. "I am sorry." Daniel felt the floor disappear beneath him. All those years he believed he was carrying responsibilities while his mother quietly carried fears she never shared. She had attended family dinners. Celebrated birthdays. Asked about his business. encouraged his ambitions. All while facing battles he never bothered to notice. A memory flashed through his mind. Last Christmas. Margaret had left early because she said she was tired. He had barely looked up from his phone. Another memory followed. A missed appointment she claimed was routine. Another. A phone call he promised to return and never did. Each memory arrived like a weight settling onto his chest. Tears filled his eyes again. Not because of the money. Not because of the documents. Because time suddenly felt fragile. Because the future he assumed would always be there no longer looked guaranteed. Margaret reached across the small distance between them and placed her hand over his. The gesture was gentle. Familiar. Unconditional. Daniel stared at her trembling hand and realized something terrifying. For years he had feared becoming responsible for his mother. Now he was afraid of losing her. For a long time, nobody spoke. Sunlight now filled room 214, replacing the gray shadows that had lingered there for days. The documents remained scattered across the tray table. The envelope lay open. The secrets it had protected for years were finally free. Daniel Collins sat beside his mother's bed with tears still resting in his eyes. The successful businessman who had entered the room carrying plans, contracts, and deadlines now looked like a little boy who had suddenly realized he was lost. Margaret Collins kept her hand gently over his. Even after everything he had said, even after everything he had forgotten, she offered comfort instead of judgment. That was who she had always been. Daniel looked at her and struggled to find words. Every apology felt too small. Every explanation felt meaningless. I do not know what to say, he whispered. Margaret smiled softly. Then do not say anything. Daniel lowered his head. For years he had measured life through achievements. Promotions. Investments. Property values. Business growth. He knew how to read financial statements and negotiate contracts. Yet sitting beside his mother, he realized there were things far more valuable than success. Things he had neglected while chasing everything else. He remembered the old house. The one he had been so eager to sell. Suddenly it was no longer just a piece of property. It was the place where his mother worked late into the night at the kitchen table balancing bills. The place where she helped him with homework. The place where she celebrated every victory and comforted every failure. The walls held memories he had nearly traded away without a second thought. Emily Carter quietly prepared to leave the room. Her role in the story was finished. The truth no longer needed a witness. It had found its voice. Before stepping into the hallway, she glanced back one last time. The scene before her looked completely different from the one she had witnessed the day before. Not because the room had changed. Because understanding had entered it. Daniel looked toward the folder containing the real estate paperwork. Without hesitation, he closed it and set it aside. Then he turned back to his mother. The house is not being sold. Margaret looked surprised. Daniel. He shook his head. No. I finally understand. His voice broke slightly. I spent years believing I built my life alone. I was wrong. Margaret squeezed his hand gently. Daniel continued. Every success I celebrated had your fingerprints on it. Every opportunity one thought I earned by myself carried your sacrifice behind it. Tears slipped down his face. He did not hide them. He no longer cared about appearing strong. Real strength looked different now. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as well. Not because she wanted recognition. Because after so many years, her son finally saw her. Truly saw her. The silence between them felt warm instead of painful. Peaceful instead of empty. Outside the window, the clouds had completely broken apart. Blue sky stretched across the horizon. Daniel thought about all the missed phone calls. The rushed visits. The conversations cut short because he was too busy. He could not change those moments. Nobody could. But he could change what came next. "I am going to be here," he said quietly. "Not because I owe you. Because I love you." Margaret smiled through her tears. "That is all I ever wanted." The words settled into the room like sunlight. Simple. Honest. True. Emily stepped into the hallway and gently closed the door behind her. Inside, mother and son remained together, not separated by old misunderstandings anymore. The documents had revealed the truth, but the truth itself was not about money. It was about love that expected nothing in return. Love that sacrificed quietly. Love that remained even when forgotten. And as Daniel sat beside his mother holding her hand, he finally understood a lesson that no business deal, no promotion, and no amount of success could ever teach him. Children often remember what their parents gave them. Parents remember what they could not give. But the greatest gift Margaret Collins had ever given her son was not money, opportunity, or sacrifice. It was a love that never stopped believing he could become better than he was yesterday.